For months, this crew fired at nothing. Their weapon was built for one job: put a wall of lead into the sky and kill anything flying through it. 4 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 1 turret, nearly 2,400 rounds a minute. Enough sustained firepower to outgun an entire infantry company. It was designed to protect convoys from German fighters diving out of the clouds. But by the winter of 1944, the clouds were empty. The Luftwaffe was broken. So these anti-aircraft crews sat parked on quiet Belgian crossroads, guarding bridges no one was bombing, waiting for planes that never came. Then, on the morning of December 16th, the ground itself turned into the threat. 200,000 German troops came out of the Ardennes forest, and the fog that grounded Allied planes also grounded Allied air support, the one thing that usually broke up an attack like this. With no tanks close enough and no aircraft overhead, commanders looked at the only heavy firepower left in the sector, a weapon that had never been meant to touch the ground at all, and they aimed it there anyway. It was never supposed to fire at a man. The M45 Maxim mount was an instrument of pure mathematics. Lead computing sights, electric traverse motors spinning at 60 degrees a second, 4 Browning M2s synchronized to throw a wall of half-inch steel into the path of a diving fighter. Every specification on the M16 multiple-gun motor carriage, from its quarter-inch armor to its open-top turret, assumed the enemy would come from above, moving at 300 miles an hour, gone in seconds. By the autumn of 1944, that enemy had stopped coming. Allied bombing had crippled Germany's fuel refineries, and its pilots, the ones still alive, rarely had gas to fly. Hundreds of M16 crews sat attached to anti-aircraft battalions across France and Belgium, watching empty skies over bridges and supply depots, maintaining a weapon system with nothing left to shoot. Nobody in the War Department had written a manual for what came next. There was no doctrine for depressing 4 aircraft guns to 0 elevation and aiming them at a farmhouse, a tree line, a man in a foxhole. The M16 was a tool with exactly one designed purpose: sitting idle in the snow, 3 months before it would be ordered to do something else entirely, something its own engineers had never imagined and never intended. The threat that built this weapon had a name: Stuka. In France in 1940, and again across North Africa, German dive bombers and low-flying fighters had torn apart Allied columns that had no answer for aircraft attacking from below 1,000 feet. American planners took the lesson seriously. Mechanized divisions moving fast across open ground needed a mobile umbrella of fire that could keep pace with tanks and trucks, not static guns left behind at the last depot. The solution came from pairing 2 existing designs. The White Motor Company's M3 half-track chassis, already proven and mass-produced, provided the mobility. Onto its bed went the M45 quad mount, built by the Maxim Corporation, an electrically driven turret carrying 4 M2 heavy-barrel .50 caliber machine guns, fired in unison by a single gunner seated between them. The motors could swing the entire 2.5-ton assembly through 60 degrees a second, fast enough to track a fighter screaming past at over 300 miles an hour. Fed correctly, the 4 guns together could throw nearly 2,400 rounds a minute into the sky. By the fall of 1944, hundreds of M16s had reached the European theater, distributed to anti-aircraft battalions, attached to advancing American forces. On paper, it was exactly what the doctrine had called for: fast, mobile, devastating against aircraft. It had been designed and built for a war in the air that was, by then, already being lost by the other side bout. By September 1944, the math had turned against the Luftwaffe completely. Allied strategic bombing had spent 2 years grinding down Germany's synthetic fuel plants, and by autumn the shortage was no longer an inconvenience. It was crippling. Trained pilots existed. The gasoline to put them in the air often did not. What aircraft did fly increasingly flew crewed by replacements with a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors had logged, against Allied formations that now owned the skies over Western Europe almost without contest. For the AAA battalions running M16 half-tracks, this meant months of a war that had quietly moved past them. Their assignments were bridges, crossroads, fuel depots, supply columns, targets that, in 1940 or 1942, would have drawn German bombers within the hour. Crews stood watch in rotating shifts, scanning empty gray skies, running maintenance checks on turret motors and batteries that had nothing to track. Ammunition sat stacked and ready in tombstone magazines that hadn't been fired in weeks. It was not a comfortable idleness. Soldiers trained for a specific technical job, tracking fast-moving aircraft, calculating lead and elevation, found themselves relegated to the least eventful postings in the theater, guarding infrastructure against an air threat that increasingly failed to show up at all. Nobody yet knew that in a matter of weeks, that same idle firepower would be needed somewhere else entirely. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, German artillery opened fire along an 80-mile stretch of the Ardennes front. What followed was over 200,000 troops moving through the pre-dawn dark, supported by armor and artillery in numbers the thin American line had no way to match. The sector had been chosen deliberately, held by divisions like the 106th, newly arrived and untested in combat, and units still recovering from the losses of the Hurtgen Forest fighting weeks earlier. Within hours, the front began to come apart. American riflemen found themselves facing waves of German infantry supported by the MG-42, a machine gun capable of firing over 1,000 rounds a minute, more than double the sustained output of a standard American squad, whose automatic firepower rested on a single Browning automatic rifle with a 20-round magazine. In a straight exchange of fire, the Germans could simply outshoot them. Compounding the disaster was the weather. A dense bank of cloud and freezing fog settled over the Ardennes and stayed for days, grounding the Allied fighter bombers that had, for months, been the infantry's most reliable answer to exactly this kind of mass assault. Without air cover, isolated American units were left to fight defensive actions alone, in deep snow, against an enemy with more men, more firepower, and momentum already on its side. No order came down through proper channels. There was no revised field manual, no directive from a general's headquarters explaining how an anti-aircraft weapon should be used against infantry. It happened because junior officers, watching their sector collapse, grabbed whatever firepower was still standing and put it in the gap. AAA battalions that had spent months guarding rear area crossroads suddenly found themselves forming the front line itself. Crews were told to disengage their aerial gun sights, drop the barrels to the horizontal, and hold position. Most had never trained for this. The Max and Mount's entire targeting system was built around leading a moving aircraft, not aiming at a farmhouse window or a tree line. What happened next surprised the crews as much as the enemy. When German infantry advanced across open, snow-covered fields, confident, expecting only scattered resistance from a broken American line, M16 gunners opened fire. The combined rate of 4 Browning M2s, close to 2,400 rounds a minute, was not something German infantry doctrine had accounted for on this stretch of front. Advancing formations were shredded in seconds, not by precision, but by sheer volume, a density of fire no rifle squad or machine gun team could survive crossing in the open. For the crews themselves, it was as unplanned as it was decisive. Nobody had briefed them on this. They simply discovered, in the middle of a collapsing defense, exactly what their weapon could do to a man in the open. Surviving an ambush was one thing. Being ordered forward was another. As December wore on, American units began trying to reclaim the crossroads and villages they'd lost in the opening days. And in at least one documented case, an infantry company found itself stalled outside a small Belgian farming settlement, pinned by German machine gun teams sheltering behind stone walls, with artillery support cut off and mortars doing almost nothing against reinforced slate roofs. Without a tank available, commanders sent in an M16 instead. The half-track had no business doing this. Its armor was a quarter-inch of plate, meant to stop shrapnel, not sustain fire, and it moved forward through open snow directly into the enemy's line of sight. But the ammunition it carried was never meant for flesh in the first place. The 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round was designed to punch through aircraft engine blocks and ignite fuel tanks at altitude. Against a stone farmhouse, that same round didn't stop at the surface. It drove through brick and mortar, throwing fragments of the structure itself inward as shrapnel, a secondary effect that stripped away the cover the walls were supposed to provide. The German position went silent within moments, not suppressed but structurally destroyed. Nearby pine trees, hit by the same fire, split and snapped outright. Cover turned into another source of danger for anyone still sheltering beneath it. The quad mount's power was also its ceiling. Each of the 4 Browning M2s fed from its own ammunition can, nicknamed a tombstone for its heavy arched shape, holding 200 linked rounds apiece. Full, the mount carried 800 rounds total, a figure that sounds substantial until it's measured against the gun's own rate of fire. At close to 2,400 rounds a minute combined, a gunner holding the pedals down in a sustained burst could empty every magazine in under 20 seconds. What came after was the dangerous part. The moment the guns went dry, the M16 stopped being the most lethal weapon on the field and became a stationary, unarmed target. Reloading meant crewmen climbing out onto an open, icy deck, in full view of the enemy, to unlatch spent cans, haul in fresh 60-pound drums, thread new belts into 4 separate feed trays by hand, and charge each gun before firing could resume. A task that was slow and physically demanding, even under ideal conditions, let alone with numb fingers in sub-zero cold. The appetite this created was staggering. A single M16 could burn through 10,000 rounds in an afternoon of sustained combat, more than an entire infantry squad might carry for days. That demand fell on trucks and jeeps running resupply along roads under German observation, and on rear echelon soldiers pressed into linking belts by hand to keep the guns fed. Everything the M16 had proven against infantry and stone meant nothing the moment a tank appeared. A Panzer IV carried up to 80 millimeters of frontal armor, plate the 50 caliber armor-piercing round simply couldn't defeat. Rounds that had shattered brick and split pine trunks sparked harmlessly off sloped steel, while the half-track's own quarter-inch plating offered no protection at all against a 75 millimeter main gun. Worse, the weapon's greatest strength became a liability. The muzzle flash and smoke of sustained firing turned the M16 into an unmistakable target for any tank commander scanning the field. That trade-off played out directly at one Ardennes crossroads. An American infantry company, ordered to fall back under pressure, needed a rear guard to cover the retreat. A single M16 crew took the assignment, backing into the frozen brush and cutting the engine to listen. When German reconnaissance vehicles and infantry broke through the tree line, the gunner held fire until they were dangerously close, then opened up, the burst tearing through light German vehicles and pinning the accompanying infantry, buying the retreating Americans several minutes. But armor was coming behind that infantry, and the crew knew it. The moment the last magazine ran dry, they threw the half-track into reverse and pulled back through the frozen mud. Seconds later, a high-explosive tank shell landed exactly where they had been parked. No peacetime committee designed the M16 to do what it did in the Ardennes. Nobody in Washington sat down and decided that an anti-aircraft half-track should punch through farmhouse walls or cover a retreating company at point-blank range. That use came entirely from junior officers and half-track crews improvising under a collapsing line, with no manual to guide them and no time to ask permission. What the weapon proved wasn't really about firepower at all. It was about how narrow a design can be, and how completely context decides whether that narrowness is a strength or a death sentence. The same quarter-inch armor that made the M16 practical and cheap as an air defense vehicle made it a coffin the instant a German tank came into range. The same volume of fire that erased infantry formations and stone strongpoints also lit up the vehicle's position for anyone watching with a cannon. Nothing about the machine changed between those two outcomes, only the target in front of it. That's the harder lesson buried under the wartime nickname and the after-action reports. Doctrine holds until survival makes it irrelevant, and a weapon built to do one thing well will always carry, unchanged, the exact same vulnerabilities that made it so effective, right up until the moment those vulnerabilities are the only thing that matters.